Well, I see we already have our next guest here, so I'm behind the
Hello,
eight ball,
Tings.
as it were. But we want to move to another crucial geopolitical issue, and that is President Xi's actually ongoing. I think he's still there. Trip to Europe and France, Serbia, and Hungary. He's in Hungary today, I believe. Hopefully, I'm not behind on that one. But as always, very, very happy to be joined here by Tings Chak, who's a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute, and a member of the Dongsheng News Collective. Tings, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Eugene. Hi, Rania.
Well, let's just jump right into it. I guess maybe I'll just ask you initially. How do you see the importance of the tour by President Xi in Europe? Of course, in the U.S., what people watching this are getting is that it's some sort of sinister attempt to destroy U.S. EU unity. Obviously, the Chinese side is presenting it very differently in terms of relations between China and the EU. But anyway, before I editorialize too much here, I just want to ask your thoughts on the significance of this trip.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is the second visit of President Xi to Europe in the last 5 years, and it's actually his first visit overseas this year. So it does reflect some kind of importance, especially the priority that China is placing on its relationship with Europe, and of course with France being a major player in that relationship. Just for you to get a sense, France is actually tied with the U.S. as the most state visits by Xi, with 5 times each, and only next to Russia, which is 9 times. And of course, this trip is marked by several important anniversaries. The first is the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between France and China, 75 years with Hungary, and also 25 years since the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. But maybe we can talk about that separately. But I think what's interesting, and even how you asked the question, is that somehow the trip is being framed as really about the U.S., or China's attempt to drive a wedge, as you said. I think that the fact that U.S. sort of places itself in the middle of the China-Europe relations is very indicative of the crisis we're seeing in Europe. Because at the end of it, why should the U.S. be in the equation at all? Why aren't we just talking about what Europe needs or wants, or what is in the interest of the European people? Right now, Europe is rife with all kinds of problems. We're seeing stagnating economies, especially with the largest economies like Germany and Russia going into recession. We're seeing energy crisis, partly shooting itself in the foot after the EU cut off Russian gas for its own people. We see people who are angry, farmers' protests, worker strikes, like student protests. And it seems like the far right is the only force that's really rising in tide with the anger of the people. So amidst of all these questions, I think Europe has a lot of questions to ask itself about how it wants to pursue the relationship with China. Does it want to continue down this path? You remember in 2019, the EU officially adopted a position that put China as a so-called partner, competitor, and systemic rival, which I always found a little bit confusing. But in reality, I think the EU actually needs China, perhaps even more than China needs the EU. And in some ways, I think, especially highlighted by the visit in France, Macron took Xi to his beloved Pyrenees Mountains as a kind of warm gesture of, sort of relations between the two countries. But I think the question for me is really, is France or is Europe really ready to escape this sort of blame game that it's been part of, I think, led by the US or in the big bad China? And is it ready to develop and propose an independent path and independent set of relations with China that's in the interest of its own people and not necessarily dictated by what the U.S. wants? And I think that still remains to be seen.
Tings, how can we understand this visit in the context of France's Macron changing or having this kind of contradictory position when it comes to China?
Yeah, I think Macron has been quite interesting. If we've observed his changes in recent years, right? I think in the last year on foreign policy issues has become increasingly hawkish, especially concerning Russia and Ukraine. I think in the very beginning, when the war broke out, France, Macron was taking a line of more, we need diplomatic or we need a peaceful solution, we need to have a political solution. And then up until recently, I think as recent as February, Macron was making these bombastic claims of, that they wouldn't omit the possibility of putting French troops in Ukraine, which was quite bold, right? He was trying to definitely show a strong stance wherever that was leading him. But what's interesting is that I think and I think it coincides with his visit first to China and then subsequently with Xi's visit to France, some shifting tones. One thing we're hearing Macron say much more is, instead of talking about the strategic rival that is China, but moving towards strategic autonomy for Europe and for France, and not wanting to, and I'm quoting him, to be America's followers. And some things I just want to bring some of the quotes of his in recent times that I think are worthwhile to note. When he came back from China on the equivalent of the Air Force Ones of France, he said, Europe must reduce its dependency on the United States and avoid getting dragged into the confrontation with China and the US over Taiwan. And then shortly after, he was talking about a very kind of somber look at the state of Europe. He said, our Europe today is mortal and it can die. And we have to actually show ourselves not to be a vassal of the United States. And then later on, after Xi's visit, very interestingly, Macron goes and says, we have no desire to be at war with Russia or the Russian people. We don't want a regime change in Moscow. And now more than ever, France wants to strengthen cooperation with China because it bears on the future of Europe. So I think some of these things are worthwhile to note. We don't know exactly where this is going to take, how much they're willing to kind of move forward to a position of strategic autonomy, as they're calling it, and build more cooperation with China. Because at the end of the day, Macron still feels the need to say, well, when push comes to shove, we still prefer the U.S. as our ally.
It'll be interesting to see it develop for sure. And, one of the things we mentioned, or you mentioned earlier, is the poignancy of the trip to Serbia, given this being the 25th anniversary of the bombing of the Chinese embassy in what was then actually Yugoslavia, but in Belgrade, now the capital of Serbia. And I'm just curious some of your thoughts around that. And you're based in China, so I'm also curious perhaps some of the reaction to that leg of the trip amongst Chinese people, because obviously it's a very, very evocative issue.
Yeah, I mean, definitely this is a very politically significant date for President Xi to visit. I mean, he chose May 7th, which is the 25th year since the bombing. And I think it's quite important because despite the fact that NATO has always said that it was an accident, China and the Chinese people have never accepted that response. And it was made quite clearly in a letter that Xi wrote and was published in a Serbian outlet called Politika. And he said that 25 years ago today, NATO flagrantly bombed the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. And this we should never forget. The Chinese people cherish peace, and we would never allow such tragic history to repeat itself. So clearly that was a strong political statement to say, condemning actually NATO aggressions, which I think in this moment is not a not so subtle criticism of NATO as well, bringing in this historical legacy as well. So I think the fact that Xi made a visit to Serbia as one of his three countries on his European leg is very symbolic politically, but also has huge resonance for the Chinese people who remember this bombing deeply till today. As well as, the strengthening of relations between the two countries. Serbia, though not an EU member, it's a candidate member, but is an important player in the European scene, especially around having good relations with China. They just, for example, elevated their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partner, which is the only country in the Central or Eastern Europe to have that. So it's definitely signaling towards being a stronger European partner in the years to come.
And then, Tings, as is often the case throughout this visit, we had the issue of fair competition that was often brought up by various European officials, including one of our all-time favorites, Ursula von der Leyen, comes from lineage of plantation owners and Nazis. Always have to mention that. Hey. But she happened to be hanging around France, and we heard that we hear that terminology a lot from the Americans, hearing it from this sort of like European Atlanticists, the fair competition, right? And this is, of course, for those who don't know, it's a nod to this Western critique of Chinese overcapacity in terms of economic production. Chinese overcapacity. But what can we make of this claim about fair competition, which is being widely used to suggest that China's not playing fair economically?
I mean, it's quite hilarious, right? Because for decades, we just accept the fact that the Volkswagens or the Fords and all the cars from Europe and US manufacturers are on the streets And that's just a given. That's just the status quo we should always accept, right? Like there was never a European or American overcapacity issue in our countries. But the moment that we start producing these things, especially when we move up the value chain and start producing cars, electric vehicles, or cell phones, then that becomes a problem of overcapacity. So I think that's always interesting when it becomes a problem and when it isn't a problem and should just be maintained and imposed on our countries easily. But I think one of the things, it's just easy to use China as a scapegoat, right? To project, I think, some of the problems I mentioned already in Europe or in the US, these internal conflicts, and just project it on an external rival, right? And so it's important to blame China instead of actually addressing the real questions of the decline in Europe's competitiveness or the US competitiveness, or actually real questions of production and the real economy that are not being resolved in the respective countries. It's easier to blame China's overcapacity problem. But at the same time, I think there's sometimes confusions about what is it that Europe wants or a country like France wants. At some point, it's like, oh yeah, we do like the Chinese EVs because they are cheaper and they're well produced. But then we also want to increase tariffs on these imported cars because, they're being subsidized by the government or something like that. But then they want to keep the Chinese cars out. But at the same time, they're fighting amongst each other to build Chinese factories of these EV factories, for example. For example, this time coming out of this meeting is the first BYD, which is a Chinese electric vehicle company, is going to start producing creating its own factory in Hungary, which is the first European factory it's going to have. So they've been competing to try to attract these factories, but at the same time, they want to keep the cars out. So at the same time, they have to make up their own minds. And I think one of the other things I just wanted to point out, it's kind of deviating a little bit, but I think it's just it's such an easy sort of fix to blame China and have these sort of Western criticisms. And I think one thing I wanted to note that I think media didn't cover very much of is what Xi Jinping said, and used this platform in France to talk about actually making his own criticism of what needs to be truly criticized, which is the question of Gaza, question of Palestine. So Xi Jinping used this platform to talk about, again, very consistent line, the necessity to immediately have a sustainable ceasefire, Palestine's full membership in the UN, statehood, and all these things that I think China has been quite clear on. So I think that, in a way, is a focus that he wanted to draw our attention to, instead of this sort of, kind of stuff about problems of overcapacity and whatnot.
No, I think it's a good point. The New York Times, just a couple of days ago, and the New York Times is almost always publishing negative things about China, said themselves that there is little sign of any surge of cheap Chinese products in the official trade data. So even the New York Times saying this is totally fake and totally false in every way. But I think you're right. Easy to scapegoat China, and quite frankly, and I think you probably agree with this, Tings, the element of racism makes it even easier, in the context of the American mind. But as always, we really appreciate the opportunity to have you on. Everyone who's not following the Dongsheng News Collective or Tricontinental, I don't know what you're doing. You're obviously not paying close attention to Breakthrough News, but you need to start paying attention to them because they have excellent folks working for them, like Tings, who's a researcher with both organizations. But thanks so much for giving us some of your time and staying up very late for us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.